Thank you, Sujita, for the opportunity. And here is Waiting for Revolution, the Waiting for Swaraj, I'm sorry, The Inner Lives of Indian Revolutionaries, the new book by Dr. Aparna Vaidik. Welcome, Aparna. What
Thank you.
is it about waiting for Swaraj that prompted you to write this book? It's been around for 75 years, isn't it?
Sure. So, Suraj, the book is about waiting more than it is about Swaraj. And the waiting over here is really refers to what revolutionaries do. So, this book is about revolutionaries who never had a revolution. So the question is, why do they even call themselves revolutionaries? Why should historians call them revolutionaries? Why should people think of them as revolutionaries? So this is really the question that the book explores. How do we understand a revolutionary's ontology? And the answer is often given in terms of, revolutionaries are people who engage in these spectacular bombings, spectacular assassinations, and their lives are these remarkable individuals with heroic deeds and all that. However, an ordinary revolutionary's life has less to do with these spectacular events, but more to do with waiting, because they wait out the time until the revolution is supposed to come or until Swaraj is supposed to come. So it is on that time of waiting. It is when they are and waiting is a time that often most of us associate with stasis. We associate it with idleness or anxiety or frenzy. And waiting as an idea has been written about in several different ways. It's very much prominent, like waiting for Godot, and waiting is so it's seen as waste of time or whiling away. But actually, I try and talk about how waiting is the most constitutive aspect of their ontology, how it is the most constructive and creative dimension of a revolutionary's life. This is where the real action is, not just when they kill someone or they throw a bomb, but action is here also. Action is in the underground life. So that's what the book is about. And Swaraj
Yeah.
is what they wait for. So, just quickly. So, initially I had titled the book Waiting for Revolution. And then I changed it to Waiting for Swaraj. Because the question for me was, what are they really waiting for? Are they waiting for revolution? And the answer that these revolutionaries had was no, they were not waiting for Kranti, they were doing Kranti. Yeah, so waiting was Kranti also. They were engaged
Right.
in the task of revolution, but what they really were waiting for was Swaraj. So that's
So
the.
this is a book about the time when the revolutionaries weren't really scripting revolution in a conventional sense, or in the sense
Yes.
that Amar Chitrakatha books talk and write about them. I refer to Amar Chitrakatha because I find you frequently referring to Amar Chitrakatha book as what us history students call interlocutors. You are not that often referring to professional historians. You, of course, do all the time. You refer to many of them, but one of your most important interlocutors appeared to be the writers, publishers, and propagators, really, of Amar Chitrakatha books. Who are they, and why are they such an important interlocutor for you in this book in particular? It's a thoroughly academic book.
Yeah. See, we think of revolution as primarily as event, something that happens. An event is an occurrence that is bound by time. So we can actually chop up time or carve out time as pre-event time, the time of the event, and time after the event. So generally, history is studied as event. So you'll study Second World War, you will study Revolt of 1857, you'll study Partition of India or something. So that is the traditional mode of studying history or understanding history, that history is an event, an occurrence is history. Yeah. So, so this idea of when you're trying to study their lives in waiting, when you're trying to study their inner lives, then you have to move away from the idea of event as history. However, the dominant view about the revolutionaries is associated with different kinds of events. And this view is popularized or scripted. One of the primary one of the primary modes in which it got scripted was through the Amar Chitra Katha in the 1970s. So not only are historians playing a role in the way we write about the past and think about the past, but there is a lot of popular literature out there. So you see, Kama MacLean's work is there, fantastic writing on the revolutionaries. Now what she has looked at is the print culture. Print culture in the 1920s and 30s that crafts a certain imagination of the revolutionaries. Now, although I'm looking at the revolutionaries and their lives in the 1920s, so the book moves in between that time and the 1970s, when that is the moment in post-independence history when revolutionaries start getting written about and start appearing in the popular culture. And one of the popular culture elements is Amar Chitra Katha, at least in Northern India. But it's interesting, like my book centers around life of Chandrasekhar Azad. Yeah. You don't find Chandrasekhar Azad proliferating in that manner as you see Bhagat Singh.
Bhagat Singh, absolutely.
So one of the things with writing of revolutionaries is the focus on event, and the other focus on Bhagat Singh. So the book is trying to move away from both those ways of looking at the past through the framework of event and through the framework of Bhagat Singh. And in that, in order to move away from that, I use Amar Chitra Katha. That's why Amar Chitra Katha becomes an important interlocutor. That how is it crafting the popular imagination about the revolutionaries? So in the popular imagination, Chandrasekhar Azad will appear. Yeah, in some places, not in all places, but in historiography, he tends to be absent.
Right. Since you have already mentioned, let me just reiterate the point that although it's called Waiting for Swaraj, it's practically an exploration about the life and being, really, of Chandrasekhar Azad. Before I get into a slightly more theoretical question, which can wait, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the early life of Chandrasekhar Azad, because these revolutionaries, as you rightly said, appear to come to the popular domain as fully formed. So there is this Azad as Amir Khan in Rang De Basanti, who's muscular, who's manly, who's fearless, and who's really not afraid of death. But he's a young man, a leader, a born leader, doesn't escape, is ready to die, and so forth. But the book, your second chapter in particular, is really about the making of a young man who debuted as a Gandhian and the metamorphosis of the Gandhian Azad, really, to the Krantikari Azad. And I advisedly use the word Krantikari and not revolutionary because he did it. And later you'd make a distinction between an Inqilabi and a Krantikari, on which I'll have a question later. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the early life, the colorful life, the upper caste life, the religious life, the laborly life, the Bhairupiya life of Azad? It's a wonderful story, and I'd request the listeners to pay attention here. It is far better and more exciting than a film. Aparna.
Thank you. And here I want to just stop and thank Sujitda and Kahani Koncheti for giving us this platform to talk about Chandrasekhar Azad. So, when I started working on the revolutionaries, there are many of them. Yeah. And I somewhere got lost in the number of people who were out there. But then somehow Chandrasekhar Azad stood apart from all of them. Yeah. Now, I'll tell you first why Chandrasekhar Azad and then a little bit about him. Yeah. Now, Chandrasekhar Azad is one of those unique revolutionaries who had a 10-year-long revolutionary career. Now, revolutionaries generally had very short lives, or or lasted in the field only for maximum 2 years. And this is the calculation
Right.
that the revolutionaries had done themselves. This is not a calculation I've done as a historian. The general belief among the revolutionaries was that we will last in the underground only for 2 years before we are caught, hanged, or
Sent to an exile and so on. Yeah.
killed. Yeah, or sent to Andamans. Now, who are the ones who lasted for very long? The ones who lasted for very long were really people who were ideologues. The ideologues lasted for several years, and ideologues often never threw a bomb or pulled a trigger. Yeah. So see, my phone is going off in the recording. But Chandrasekhar Azad was one of those unique revolutionaries who was in the underground for 10 years. Yeah. And he participated not only in the HSRA, not only in Bhagat Singh's party, Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, but also in HRA, the party from
Republican Army.
Yeah, HRA, from which HSRA had morphed. Yeah, so his life actually provides us with an entry point into a decade-long revolutionary history. That's what makes him unique. Yeah. Another element of his being very unique is that he is not like the other revolutionaries in the sense he is not like the revolutionaries that we read about. Most of the revolutionaries that we read about are college-educated youth, people who come from petty bourgeoisie background, middle class backgrounds. Many of them are coming from even Rai Bahadur families, very well educated. In fact, in Bengali revolutionaries, you have many people who are very well educated, who come from very well-to-do families. Now, here is a person who is actually not coming from that kind of a background. So his background is very unique. He's coming from the tribal belt. He's an upper caste man coming from a tribal belt in Madhya Pradesh, and spends his early life as a laborer on the Bombay dockyard. And then he, lives over there for a while and, keeps wearing the same clothes for days on end. And then there was no way he didn't even have enough money to wash his clothes. So he would just throw away the old clothes and buy the secondhand new, washed clothes and just wear that, like that. So that's how his life went. And then somebody told him, why don't you go to Banaras and study there? They give free food to Brahmin boys. So he sits on a train and travels up to Banaras. And that's how he reaches Banaras, where he gets mobilized into the nationalist movement as a Gandhian. So the story, that is told of sort of the apocryphal story about Azad is him getting, caned on the order of the magistrate because he had gone for a Gandhian picketing in non-cooperation movement. And then after that, he becomes very famous, acquires the nickname Azad. He's nicknamed Azad. And it's after that revolutionaries cast their eye on him. And it takes them to quite a bit of time to pull him into their ambit. So he's a highly unwilling Krantika. Like he's a hard nut to crack. So there is a presumption in historiography that revolutionaries were always revolutionaries. Like, in Hindi, there is a saying, "Poot ke paon palne mein dikhai dete." So there are all these stories about Bhagat Singh sewing the small sticks which will turn into, guns and all that, as if he was born to be a revolutionary or he was always thinking about revolution, or guns and bombs were always on his mind. No, but that's not true. That's not true, at least of Chandrasekhar Azad, that, but in the 1970s, when Amar Chitra Katha gets written, Amar Chitra Katha also presents him as someone who was always given to, sticks and bombs and guns.
He was made of fire, it seems sometimes. I mean, he's a walking, talking ball of fire.
Yeah, so that's the way he's presented.
Yeah.
That's the way he's presented. Yeah. And I think that's the kind of imagery that I push back against. That revolutionaries are not prefabricated. There's a journey they make. But the way we write about them, the way historiography has shown them, as if they were always like that. So there is so it's a journey that I talk about. That's why waiting.
Right. So Chandrasekhar Azad is a peculiar character in many, many senses. I mean, to the end of his life, he remains a high caste Brahmin. one of the things you write he does is to want to get out as some kind of an escape from his village and small town life, because he was looking to get into a larger world. He was bored. And then that story about there simply not being enough hygiene and enough money for him to even take regular baths, and having to discard old clothes which he buys. He buys old clothes all the time and discard after 7 days of wearing consistently without change. So a very strange kind of Brahmin. Later, of course, you relate a story about his taking to eggs, and more jokes. We'll come to that. But here, in moving on, you talk about the transition to socialism and communism of a certain vantage, which is very distinctive, especially for Azad and for a number of other Banaras North Indian revolutionaries, as opposed to Bhagat Singh. Even for Bhagat Singh, it was a somewhat incomplete transition. And you make a careful distinction between them and the communists at two levels. One is in terms of their site of action and actual networks of activity and programs, and at another level in terms of their concrete reading, knowledge, and understanding of literature of socialism and communism. And many of them appear to be inspired and kept being inspired at the same time from their reading of ancient Indian sages and seers, and Lenin on the other hand, without appearing to make a great deal of distinction. So what kind of a world was this, where there were socialists were not exactly averse to communists, but even when they are talking and really taking part in conversations about action with communists, they are not really fully coming under the umbrella or influence of Indian communists. And they were quite suspicious, really, skeptic also of Indian communists. One of them said, and you quote, that ye log humko bachcha samajhte the. Especially the debate with regard to the insertion of the word socialist. And one of the things I don't know very well, but it seems to me, is your unique discovery that the constitution of Hindustan Socialist Republican Army and that of Hindustan Republican Army is the very same document, except the word socialist. And your engagement with the Marxist historians and their treatment of foregrounding of Bhagat Singh. So take us through that world of socialism, communism, and Krantikarism, if I may use that word. Yeah.
Again, I will go back to the moment where I started conceptualizing this project. Now, what we have to remember is that history writing, when historians write history, we are writing about the past, but we are writing about the past in the present. So our presentist understanding of the past, the questions of the present, impact or influence the kind of questions we ask of the past. Yeah. So in our present, how do we understand politics? We understand it in terms of watertight compartments between left and the right. And that is what was guiding my vision at the time I was conceiving of this project. But as I went on, as I moved, so somewhere at some level, I was writing the genealogy of Indian socialism. Okay, that was my starting point. And that remained for a while. But when I chanced upon these memoirs, it led to a whole lot of confusion. I was like, okay, I am understanding, I am thinking of this as genealogy of socialism, genealogy of the left. But where is the left in them? Where are they actually talking about all this? And that's when my framework began to change. I realized there is some other story over here. This is not a story simply of, this is not the long durée history of Indian socialism. It can be that, it is that, but there is a lot more here. Yeah. And so we can think about 1920s as that moment, or as the one of those last moments, or a phase, one of the last phases in Indian history, after which you start seeing the splintering of right and left. That distinction is not that clear in the 1920s. And I say that not just on the basis of the Indian Communist Party or the formation of Hindu Mahasabha or the formation of these revolutionary groups, not just that, but you will see a lot of Congress people, congressmen, were also members of right-leaning.
Yeah.
It was
Malviya, of course.
Yeah. Yes. And
one of the prominent.
Madan Mohan Malviya, Govind Vallabh Pant, and even Motilal Nehru, all three of them supported the revolutionaries. They are known to have given Sachinnath Sanyal and Chandrasekhar Azad regular money. They would turn, Motilal Nehru until he died, and Kama writes about it, that until he died, he was giving them money, he was giving them support. Many Congress people were doing it. Yeah. So that's one thing to remember, that ideologies were not yet into that watertight compartment. I'll give you one more example, which is very interesting. Now, where does Bhagat Singh learn his communism? Where does he learn about socialism? Yeah. So people will say this answer, but actually he lived at Ganesh Vidyarthi's press, Pratap Press, for quite some time. Yeah. That's where he got introduced to several people. Now, who is Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi? He is a Gandhian, but a Gandhian who regularly publishes revolutionary material. Yeah, and he had this dear friend who was part of the Mazdoor Kisan Sabha with him, called Radha Mohan Gokul.
Gokul, yeah.
Yes. Now, Radha Mohan Gokul, who is he? Radha Mohan Gokul is a man who writes pamphlets in Hindi. Communism kya hai, Marxwad kya hai. So he's translating and creating these small gutkas, these small pamphlets for people to read and popularize these ideas. But at the same time, Radha Mohan Gokul is a Paka Arya Samaji and believed in Shuddhi in the early years. Okay, so you see people are shifting, the ideological terrain is shifting at this time. People are moving, people can believe in two different ideologies as we see them today simultaneously at that time. So this is a very different world. And entering it through the revolutionary memoirs allowed me to encounter this world, which was not yet like the world that we live in. And that's where I had to shed my presentist understanding of the past. So am I still answering your question? I think this is what you asked.
No, you certainly are, because that lets me ask a follow-up question, which is to kind of get into the terrain of religion. Since you mentioned Arya Samaj and in Lahore, in Banaras and elsewhere, it also lets me ask a connected question, which is your portrayal of the relationship between, say, someone like Ram Prasad Bismil and Ashfaq Ullah Khan, and the question of secularism coming in. I'd actually like to push you there a bit. Tell us a little bit about the relationship between Bismil and Ashfaq Ullah Khan. Quite unlike those three, idolizing kind of movies which came out in 2007, I think, on Bhagat Singh and others. And also, of course, Rang De Basanti, where these people are young guys, they just make friends. Initially, there's some kind of a skepticism about religious practices, but by and large, they kind of erase or forget and somehow, supersede their religious divisions. In reality, they don't seem to. And Bismil seemed to be patronizing Ashfaq Ullah, who seem again to be a bit of a loyal junior of sorts, who sort of ignores or does not try to assert or practice his Islamness or Muslimness that much. He's what you call the good Muslim in the liberal model of sorts, the Mamdani good bad Muslim binary model. So it's a fascinating story because it also anticipates and significantly qualifies the later left portrayal of some of these relations. And that's a terrific part of the book. And let me also take this opportunity to tell readers that this is probably a book that's not only reasonable, in fact, small, relatively speaking, in length for an academic book, but also something that's written in a language that practically competes with Amar Chitrakatha. And I mean this as a mark of respect in clarity and in accessibility. So please try and get yourself a copy. And thank you once again, Sujita, for letting me do this, and for Kahani Kanchayati for hosting us. But tell us more about Ashfaqullah and Bismil and secularism.
So, Anirban, to answer this question, I'll have to go back to where I started answering the last question, which is historians are writing about the past, but they write about the past in the present. So the word, ask yourself, you're a historian, you know this, you would know this well. Was the word secularism being used in the 1920s in the way, with the same meaning, in the way we used it in 70s and the way we use it now?
I wish it was.
So we could write an entire genealogy of the changing lives of the word secularism. And there is a lot of commentary out there about the word secularism, but the word doesn't carry the same meaning. And several times in post-colonial India, when Ashfaq and Bismil were written about, they were absorbed within the quote-unquote secularist frame. Now, secularist frame is Hindu-Muslim bhai-bhai. But it doesn't prevent the Hindu bhai from being the older bhai.
Yes.
Okay. So that's how Ashfaq and Bismil's relationship was transacted. Yeah, it was very much in that framework. Very little was asked of Bismil in terms of observing anything Islamic. However, Ashfaq, changed his dress, the way he lived, and became a sort of Jay and Viru story, kind of thing. And who's the guy in that Sholay movie? Who's the guy who sits in the dicky and who actually rides the motorbike? Is it
Viru actually sits on this holder. It's not dicky, it's something else. I forget.
The side
it used to be there in my father's generation.
So
it's no longer there. And Viru
so
is the guy who sits
Viru,
and
and Bismil gets to be Jai. But who is in the driving seat? It is Ashfaq. It is Bismil.
Yeah.
And Ashfaq rides the sidecar. So that is really what it is.
Sidecar, that's right.
Yeah. In the secular frame, they still remain bhai, devoted to each other. Yeah. So that is. So I'm just putting that relationship back in the historical frame and trying to analyze it. And another element of secularism is secularism. There's a lot of critique post anti-CNRC protest movement. There has been a lot of critique of the word secular, not from the right wing, but from the Islamic scholars and the Islamic commentators who say that a secular position does not necessarily preclude an Islamophobic position. One could be secular and yet be Islamophobic. And that's what one finds in Bismil's writing, in Bismil's understanding. And this opens me up as a writer, as a historian, to attack by a certain way in which past has been written about, or the way somebody like Bismil has been appropriated. Yeah, but if you actually read his writings and what Ashfaq has to write, there are elements there. No doubt they are great friends, but you can't turn your face away from the other elements of their relationship, which actually makes it highly unequal. Yeah. So that's what, and the recurrent images, the recurrent invocation of their, friendship, even in the protest movements later. So that recurrent invocation is really for that moment, but tells us very little about what happened in history. So
that kind of brings me to two more tempting questions, but time will not permit me to ask both. So I leave out the last but kind of most profound philosophical reflection in the book for another occasion. And that might be a little hard to digest sort of thing for the audience as well. But let me ask a slightly more political question. This distinction that I was earlier talking about, these revolutionaries being socialist in a very rough and ready sort of manner, and certainly not being communist. You walk that out beautifully in the third chapter. And especially around the concept of socialism, around the constitution on the one hand, and the pamphlet literature, really publicity material of the HSRA, you make a clear distinction between the two. Why were they socialists? How were they, in a certain sense, tangentially speaking, more nationalist, quote unquote, and certainly not communists?
Okay, so this is a distinction that I don't make. It is
They
a distinction they make.
They do.
And
absolutely.
this is the distinction that the communist leaders of the time make. So I saw the private papers of Shaukat Usmani, one of the people implicated in one of the communist leaders implicated in the Meerut conspiracy case. He says this. Ajoy Ghosh, he says this. So it is about bringing that material to the fore and asking, what does this really mean? Why are the communists distinguishing themselves from these folks? And why are these folks distinguishing themselves from the communists? What does socialism actually mean to them? Now, before I answer what it means to them, I will ask, there are so many socialists amongst us academics. I would want to ask, are they Saint-Simonians? Are they following Charles Fourier? Are they Nehruvian? What do these distinctions mean to us also? Very few can actually make these distinctions out for us. How many people can talk about these ideas clearly and cogently? Socialism for us also remains a nebulous, amorphous thing identified with certain elements, right? It was the same for them. And socialism was a new buzzword after the Bolshevik Revolution. Radha Mohan Gokul is writing these pamphlets in Hindi, which these young men are reading. So you could be a Gandhian and be a socialist. You could be Hindu Mahasabha and be a socialist. And you could just be a socialist. Or you could also be a Krantikari and be a socialist. So even Azad was asked, socialism kya hai? So he would respond, socialism, when a time would come that all of us would have khichdi to eat, clothes to wear, and a house to live in. For him, it was that. And many of these young men, as I said, Chandrasekhar is representative of those young men. Like in the sense, he is not representing them, but he is like many others who actually come from a very poor background and become part of the revolutionary circle, who are not coming from a petty bourgeois background or a well-to-do family or a middle-class family. Many of them did not have a college education. So for them, socialism was a good thing.
Yeah.
It will give poor a chance to live better. It will give us better food. They could not make a distinction between Rabindranath Tagore and Marx. Dono ka daadi hai, dono hi acha, warm, fuzzy, old Buddha. So you see that if you ask them, and this is one of the big elements of my thought process while writing the book, how do we even talk about ideology? All these ideas are going back to that central question of how do we think about ideology? Because often we think of ideas as not having any material reality. We think of ideas as having fallen from the sky and all of us start believing in it. And because we are academics and because we do a lot of intellectual work, we believe in ideas and we feel that ideas is what moves the world. I'm not saying it doesn't. But men often are unable to express their ideas, or they do not have what we call an ideology. That kind of coherence and expression is not there. And then often we say, oh, they do not have any ideas. Yeah, they're dumb, or they are, living by the gun, or, what have you. So I think the book seeks to redefine this idea of ideology, where I say ideology lies in praxis. A revolutionary is as revolutionary lives, not just as they write. And that is what Chandrasekhar Azad, Rajguru, many of these young revolutionaries espoused. For them, being a revolutionary was to live like a revolutionary, not just throw a bomb or to assassinate. So I think that's where this whole thing of, but I know you want to ask me about socialism and communism. To them, it was a bit irrelevant at the end of the day, because they had a great deal of respect even for Savarkar.
They did.
They called him Baba. So they would even go to him for counsel. So just for us to hold on to the thought that we are talking about a world where ideologies were not, divided into watertight compartments.
Hardened up as uncrossable boundaries as yet. Absolutely.
And that's why Swaraj was very important. They were all journeymen on this path of Swaraj. Yeah, and that's what makes their appeal. That's how they get co-opted into the nationalist pantheon. 1970s socialism, the word is inserted into our constitution. Where do you find socialists? So you go back into history and start looking for them, and then you anoint somebody. So
I actually
socialism ka.
I actually wanted to kind of both try and sum it up and ask a last question for you to conclude. On this note, the note that you keep going back, have gone back a couple of times, even during the last few minutes, is this divide that happens really during the 60s and the 70s, when what you call appropriation of these revolutionaries take place. This appropriation is the handiwork of many stakeholders, the nation state of India being the chief one among them. Amar Chitrakatha is, of course, another, and several other smaller players who later would make movies, publish comics, storybooks for children, and so forth, begin to glorify these revolutionaries into some kind of a timeless, sociologized legends who could do no wrong and who were really an embodiment of everything that was holy, saintly, and noble, and deserving of worship and submission, collective worship and submission in a ritual manner of sorts. Here, it kind of gets me to try and bring us back to this moment of what we call celebration or memorialism of sorts, of certain dates, certain occasions, as though they carry some kind of a timeless essence, holy essence of sorts, which are to be renewed through these annual rituals, such as 26th of August, midnight of the 14th and 15th of August, and how uncritically we slip into these modes of recall, where we happen to recall only independence and never partition. I wonder what really are we looking at here, because I don't have time to ask any question on how you look at the philosophy of these people, the philosophy through which they look at the question of time, being, of being born and reborn, and really of transcending time, as you write about it in a very elegant final chapter. So I'd request every reader to read it for themselves, and trust me, it's very accessible. And I repeat this perhaps at the cost of sounding boring, but do tell us what happens with this, trope of celebration or temporal breaks every year on these occasions. What are we really trying to do, and why not go back to how you spoke about looking at the past just as we look at the present, that it's messy and things are all messed up anyway?
Yeah. So I will just take a minute and talk about 1970s. What happens in the 1970s? Why 1970s? Now, 1970s is an important moment in the post-colonial history of India for a number of reasons. We all know that. Yeah, but just before the inauguration of the 70s, the late 1960s are equally important when Nehru passes away. There is Naxalite movement. Yeah, early 1970s, there is a lot of resistance movement. Railway workers strike. Yeah, Chipko Andolan. So all these green movements, they have started. So the Indian state is now finally seeing civil resistance. Yeah, and having to deal with that. Now, you see, the subaltern studies came out of this period of history, where some historians realized that they had something, the morning that they thought would come had not come. So they needed to rethink about the past. They needed to understand it differently, what happened, right? So 1970s, that way, is a very, very sort of potent period in Indian history, Indian contemporary history. Now, this is the time the revolutionaries start getting written about. People, many researchers, many historians, Chaman Lal, Bipin Chandra, and the older generation of historians start going about all over India, collecting materials on the revolutionaries, and writing about them and all that. So there is a different push, at the historians level about collecting material and writing about them, but at the level of state, at the popular level, there is an appropriation of the revolutionaries as a way to push against or push back against the domestic violence, the civil resistance. To say that, look at these revolutionaries, they shed their blood for Mother India, and look at you. Look at what you are doing. Yeah. And, there's one very beautiful article by this Professor Harleen Singh. She's an English lit professor, and she's written on this. And a lot of what I'm saying actually comes from her article. Yeah. So that's the moment where, and that's when subaltern studies comes, and they leave the nation on the wayside and start looking at the people. And guess who picks up the nation? The nation becomes something that gets appropriated by certain political parties. Yeah. So because suddenly there is a loss of interest in nation or the nationalist enterprise, and people are getting more focused on the civil society. Yeah. Now, so that is the thing. Now, the annual commemorations. Now, annual commemorations are also changing in their meaning. These are state. This is what a post-colonial state does, or this is what monarchies do. This is what dictatorships also do. So this is something related to, statism, annual commemoration of a certain kind of a past. But that past keeps changing meaning. And Anirban, you and I are the and many of the listeners maybe are the pre-liberalization generation. So for us, 26th January has a whole different meaning, than the generation today. So, so these are just state events, state commemorations, commemorative practices that the state imbues it with its own meaning, and then the people, with the times, their meaning also changes. But then nevertheless, if nothing, it allows us all, it's like Thanksgiving, all of us have chutti, we can all gather together, and if there is a family, you can, partake of a meal together. So it allows us to let our hair down and just relax and enjoy the freedom, think about the freedom which is available to us. So the freedoms that are available to us and which are not all.
It gave me an opportunity to talk to a senior after a long time at the end of the day, which I think is freedom enough for most of us. A holiday, we get to enjoy ourselves, get good food, maybe look better, have a good shave and so forth. I'll ask my wife to get me a decent perfume at some point in time and so forth. So thank you so much, Aparna, for your time. I've had great pleasure reading the book. I have a few other plans with the book, which I'll tell you later on after this talk gets over. And thank you, Kahani Kancheti, for asking me to do this, for inviting Aparna and I to get to talk to your listeners and the audience on this occasion, if not celebrating, then certainly remembering 75 years of the Independence Day of India. Thank you very much, Shojitda and Aparna. I've had a great time.
Thank you, Shojitda and Kahani Kancheti. Thank you.